The snow fell like ash over the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, masking the sound of 200,000 German soldiers moving through the darkness. In his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler clutched a worn map of Belgium, his trembling fingers tracing the route that would either resurrect the Third Reich or seal its doom forever. Main Fur, the weather reports are favorable, announced General Alfred Jodl, stepping into the dimly lit war room where Hitler had spent countless sleepless nights planning what he called Operation Watch on the Rhine. The German dictators, eyes sunken and feverish, fixed on the offensive lines marked in red across the map. This was his master stroke, a surprise attack, through the very forest where German forces had achieved stunning victory in 1940. The plan was audacious beyond measure. While Allied forces celebrated what they believed was Germany's inevitable collapse, Hitler had secretly assembled his last reserves. The 6th Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army led by Erich Brandenberger. These battle-hardened divisions, many pulled from the crumbling Eastern Front, represented Germany's final gamble. According to declassified Wehrmacht documents from the German Federal Archives, Hitler personally insisted on the Ardennes as the event point of attack, despite strong opposition from his generals, Colonel Johann Peiper. Commanding the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler studied his orders in the pre-dawn darkness. His Kampfrat Peiper would spearhead the northern thrust, racing 60 miles to seize the vital fuel depots at Stavelot and drive toward Antwerp. The 29-year-old officer knew that success depended on speed. They had perhaps 48 hours before Allied air power could reorganize and crush them. Meanwhile, 80 miles to the west in the town of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division was enjoying what he thought would be a quiet Christmas season. The veteran paratrooper, who had led his screaming Eagles through the hell of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, believed the war in Europe was winding down. Intelligence reports suggested German forces were in full retreat, incapable of mounting any significant offensive. The deception had been masterful. For weeks, German radio operators had maintained normal communication patterns while moving troops only at night. Dummy installations and false radio traffic convinced Allied intelligence that Army Group B remained in defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. Even ultra-intercepts, which had provided the Allies with unprecedented insight into German planning throughout the war, revealed nothing of Hitler's desperate scheme as the first German artillery shells began falling on American positions. Along an 85-mile front from Monchaux to Echternach, the element of surprise was complete. The thinly held line, manned primarily by new recruits and battle-weary veterans resting from recent campaigns, began to buckle under the massive assault. Captain MacDonald of the 2nd Infantry Division later wrote that the initial barrage sounded like the door of hell opening. Searchlights pierced the snowy darkness, temporarily blinding American defenders as waves of German infantry emerged from the forest like phantoms. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble, had begun. The morning of December 16th brought chaos to the American lines as German forces shattered the quiet of the Ardennes. Private First Class Vernon Harmon of the 90th Infantry Division crouched in his foxhole as 88mm shells exploded around him, sending frozen earth and splintered trees flying through the air. The 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa had never experienced anything like the ferocity of the German assault. They came out of nowhere, Harmon would later recall. One minute we were heating coffee over a small fire, the next minute the whole world was exploding. The surprise was so complete that many American units were overrun before they could mount effective resistance. Radio communications collapsed as German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny and disguised in American uniforms cut telephone lines and spread confusion behind enemy lines. Colonel Hurley Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of the initial assault near Clairvaux. Fuller, a West Point graduate who had distinguished himself in the Sicily campaign, watched helplessly as his undermanned regiment faced a full German divisions. The math was simple and terrifying. 3,000 Americans against 20,000 Germans, supported by tanks and artillery. Intelligence reports from the National Archives reveal that the German offensive caught Allied commanders completely off guard, with General Omar Bradley initially dismissing early reports as local counterattacks. By noon, German panzer columns had punched through American lines at multiple points. The 5th Panzer Army's advance elements reached Clairvaux, where desperate American defenders fought from house to house. Fuller himself manned a bazooka from the window of his command post, firing at German Mark IV tanks that rumbled through the narrow streets like mechanical dinosaurs to the north. Kampfgruppe Peiper achieved its initial objectives with ruthless efficiency. Peiper's column of Tiger tanks and armored vehicles struck the 99th Infantry Division near Heffen, scattering inexperienced American troops who had never faced seasoned SS Panzer Grenadiers. The German spearhead advanced 15 miles in the first day, leaving burning American vehicles and abandoned equipment in its wake. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Herlong of the 14th Cavalry Group attempted to establish a defensive line near Poto, but his light armored cars were no match for German heavy tanks. As his men fell back in growing disorder, Herlong radioed desperately for reinforcements. "We need help now, or there won't be anything left to reinforce." The confusion extended to the highest levels of Allied command. At his headquarters in "We're done," General George Patton was planning his own offensive when reports of the German attack began filtering in. The combative general, known for his aggressive tactics and colorful language, immediately grasped the significance of Hitler's gamble. "Hell, let them come," Patton growled to his staff. "We'll cut them off and chew them up." But Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower faced a more complex situation. The German offensive threatened to split his forces and potentially reach the vital port of Antwerp, cutting off supplies to 21 Allied divisions. From his headquarters at Versailles, Eisenhower ordered immediate reinforcements to the Ardennes, including the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, which were refitting after Operation Market Garden. As night fell on December 16th, German forces had achieved tactical surprise across the entire front. American casualties mounted rapidly as isolated units fought desperate delaying actions. The weather, which had grounded Allied aircraft, remained Hitler's unwitting ally. Dense cloud cover and falling snow prevented the devastating air attacks that had hammered German forces throughout the autumn campaign. Colonel Peiper's advance continued through the night, his column illuminated by burning American vehicles. The SS officer drove his men mercilessly, knowing that each hour of delay increased the likelihood of Allied countermeasures. Behind him, the German 6th Panzer Army poured through the gap, racing to exploit the breakthrough before American reserves could arrive. December 17th dawned gray and bitter. Cold as camp front, Peiper continued its relentless advance toward the Meuse River. The column of Tiger tanks, self-propelled guns, and half-tracks stretched for miles along the narrow Belgian roads, crushing everything in its path. At the head of this steel serpent, Colonel Johann Peiper pressed forward with the desperate urgency of a man who knew his nation's survival hung in the balance. Near the crossroads town of Malmedy, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was withdrawing westward when fate intervened. The unsuspecting American convoy, consisting of trucks carrying headquarters personnel and medical supplies, rounded a bend in the road and drove directly into Peiper's advancing spearhead. The encounter was swift and decisive. German tanks immediately surrounded the American vehicles, their massive guns trained on the startled soldiers. Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens of the Observation Battalion later described the moment. "We knew we were finished the second we saw those Tigers. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." Military tribunal records from the Malmedy massacre trials, held in Dachau between 1946 and 1948, provide detailed testimony about the events that followed under the watchful eyes of SS Panzer Grenadiers. Approximately 150 American prisoners were herded into a snow-covered field adjacent to the Kaf Bodar. Among them was Private First Class Homer Ford, a 22-year-old radio operator from Tennessee, who noticed the unusual tension among their German captors. The SS men seemed agitated, constantly checking their watches and scanning the horizon for signs of Allied aircraft. What happened next would become one of the most notorious war crimes of the European theater. Without warning, an SS officer drew his pistol and fired into the crowd of prisoners. The single shot was followed immediately by systematic machine gun fire from multiple positions. American soldiers fell like wheat before a scythe, their blood staining the pristine snow crimson. Private Ford threw himself to the ground at the first shot, playing dead as bullets whined overhead. "I could hear men crying for their mothers," he later testified. The Germans walked among the bodies, finishing off anyone who moved. The massacre lasted less than 15 minutes. But its impact would reverberate through the remaining months of the war. Miraculously, 43 Americans survived the slaughter by feigning death or escaping into the surrounding forest. These survivors would eventually reach American lines, carrying news of the atrocity that would steel Allied resolve and eliminate any sympathy for German forces. The news spread rapidly through American units, accompanied by orders that SS prisoners were no longer to be taken alive. Meanwhile, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate for Allied forces. German spearheads had penetrated miles into American lines, creating a dangerous bulge in the front that threatened to split the Allied armies. The town of St. Vith, defended by elements of the 7th Armored Division under Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck, became a crucial strongpoint in the American defense. General Hasbrouck, a methodical officer who had earned his reputation in North Africa, transformed St. Vith into a fortress. His men dug in among the medieval buildings, positioning anti-tank guns at key intersections and preparing for a siege. The general knew that every hour his forces held, the town bought precious. Time for Allied reserves to arrive. To the south, the strategic road junction of Bastogne faced an even more desperate situation. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had been rushed to the town with minimal equipment and supplies. McAuliffe, whose paratroopers had jumped into Normandy and Holland, now faced his greatest challenge, defending a crossroads that controlled 7 major highways. The German plan was unfolding with mechanical precision, but cracks were beginning to appear. Fuel shortages, which had plagued the Wehrmacht throughout 1944, began affecting advanced units. Piper's column, despite its initial success, was running dangerously low on gasoline and ammunition. The SS colonel had gambled everything on capturing American fuel depots intact, but determined defenders had destroyed most supplies before retreating. As December 17th ended, both sides recognized that the battle was entering a critical phase. Hitler's gamble had achieved tactical surprise and initial success, but the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. American reserves were racing toward the Ardennes, while German forces struggled to maintain their momentum against stiffening resistance. December 20th brought the first test of American resolve as German forces completely surrounded the vital crossroads town of Bastogne. The encirclement was methodical and thorough. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division sealed the northern approaches, while the 26th Volksgrenadier Division closed the southern escape routes. Inside the shrinking perimeter, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe found himself commanding a polyglot force of paratroopers, armored units, and artillery batteries that had been thrown together in the chaos of retreat. The situation inside Bastogne was desperate from the outset. The 101st Airborne Division had arrived with minimal supplies, expecting a brief deployment before returning to rear areas for rest and refit. With German forces tightening their grip around the town, McAuliffe's men faced the prospect of a prolonged siege with dwindling ammunition and medical supplies staff. Sergeant Robert Bowen of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment established his position in a foxhole on the northeastern perimeter. The forest met the edge of town. The veteran non-commissioned officer who had jumped into Normandy on DAD watched German patrols probe American defenses with growing concern. "We're sitting ducks," he confided to his squad. "We decide to really push. We don't have enough men to hold all these roads." Combat interviews conducted by the Army Historical Division immediately after the battle revealed the severe shortages faced by defenders, including critical lack of medical supplies and winter clothing. The psychological pressure on the defenders was immense. German loudspeakers broadcast propaganda messages throughout the night, promising warm food and medical care to Americans who surrendered. The messages delivered in perfect English by German-American prisoners of war were particularly effective. During the bitter cold nights when temperatures dropped well below freezing, Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment walked his perimeter daily, checking on his men and assessing defensive positions. Harper, a regular Army officer who had served in the Philippines before the war, recognized the signs of unit cohesion beginning to fray under extreme stress. Frostbite cases were mounting rapidly, and ammunition shortages forced strict rationing of artillery support. The crisis reached its peak on December 22nd, when German negotiators approached American lines under a white flag. The formal surrender demand, typed on official Wehrmacht letterhead, was addressed to the USA. Commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The message warned of annihilation. If American forces did not capitulate within 2 hours, McAuliffe's response became legendary in American military history. After reading the German ultimatum, the general supposedly exclaimed "nuts," and initially planned to ignore the demand entirely. However, his staff convinced him that military protocol required a formal response. The typed reply, delivered to stunned German officers, consisted of a single word: NUTS. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, McAuliffe's operations officer, later explained the choice of words. "We wanted something that was distinctly American, something the Germans would have to think about." The response perfectly captured the defiant spirit of the surrounded garrison and became a rallying cry for American forces throughout the remaining battle. German forces responded to the rejection with increased artillery bombardments and probing attacks. The 77th Grenadier Regiment launched a major assault against the northwestern sector defended by Team Cherry. A mixed force of tanks and infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry. The attack was repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides, but it demonstrated German determination to reduce the Bastogne pocket. Meanwhile, General George Patton was executing one of the most remarkable military maneuvers of the war. Army, which had been advancing eastward toward the Rhine, executed a 90-degree turn northward in less than 72 hours. The maneuver involved moving more than 200,000 men and their equipment across icy roads while maintaining combat effectiveness. Logistical achievement that showcased American military efficiency. Captain Dwight Eisenhower, commanding a company of the 4th Armored Division's 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, led the spearhead of Patton's relief column. The young officer, nephew of the Supreme Allied Commander, pushed his men relentlessly through German roadblocks and ambushes as they fought to reach the surrounded paratroopers. Each mile gained came at a terrible cost, but the momentum of the advance gradually built. As December 22nd ended, the siege of Bastogne had become a symbol of American determination. The defenders, though surrounded and outnumbered, had demonstrated that Hitler's gamble faced increasingly stiff resistance. The question remained whether relief would arrive, for the garrison's ammunition and medical supplies were completely exhausted. December 23rd brought the first clear skies in a week, and with them came the thunderous roar of Allied aircraft returning to the battlefield. The weather break marked a crucial turning point in Hitler's desperate gamble. As hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swept across the Ardennes, hunting German armor with devastating effectiveness, Major Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group led the first major airstrike against Camp Frupp, Piper's stranded column near Stoumont. Johnson, an ace with 27 confirmed victories, could hardly believe the target-rich environment spread before him. It was like a turkey shoot, he later recalled. German tanks and vehicles were backed up for miles with nowhere to hide. Air attacks caught German forces completely unprepared. For 7 days, Luftwaffe fighters had been grounded by the same weather that aided the initial offensive. Now, with fuel reserves critically low and many aircraft transferred to defend the Reich against strategic bombing, German air cover was virtually non-existent. Piper's Panthers and Tigers, which had terrorized American forces during the advance, became sitting targets for rocket-armed fighter bombers. Official Luftwaffe records, captured after the war, show that German air strength in the West had declined. Fewer than 200 operational aircraft by December 1940-4, Colonel Johann Piper recognized that his situation had become untenable. Spearhead, once the pride of the 6th Panzer Army, was trapped near La Gleize with no fuel, limited ammunition, and American forces closing from 3 directions. The SS officer, whose tactical brilliance had carried German forces deeper into Allied lines than any other unit, now faced a desperate choice between annihilation and retreat. The decision to abandon his heavy equipment was perhaps the most difficult of Piper's military career. The Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns that had spearheaded the German advance were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. 800 German soldiers began a harrowing march back through American lines, leaving behind the dreams of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. Meanwhile, the relief of Bastogne was entering its final phase. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, smashed through German defensive positions southwest of the town. Abrams, whose aggressive leadership style earned him the nickname Combat, drove his Sherman tanks through successive German roadblocks with methodical determination. The breakthrough came at 4:50 in the afternoon of December 26th, when elements of Abrams' battalion made contact with paratroopers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The meeting occurred on the Asenia Road, where Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 4th Armored Division encountered Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard of the 101st Airborne Division. "How are you, General?" Bogus reportedly asked McAuliffe when the relief column reached the town center. The general's response was characteristically understated. "Gee, I am mighty glad to see you." The siege of Bastogne, which had captured world attention and symbolized American determination, was officially ended after 7 days of desperate fighting. The successful defense of Bastogne and the destruction of Piper's spearhead marked the beginning of German retreat throughout the Ardennes. Hitler's gamble, which had initially achieved stunning tactical success, was foundering on the rocks of American resilience and logistical superiority. The Fuhrer, monitoring the battle from his underground bunker, refused to acknowledge the deteriorating situation and continued to demand attacks that his exhausted forces could no longer sustain. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, privately recognized that the offensive had failed to achieve its strategic/Stexter objectives. Despite initial breakthroughs, German forces had been unable to cross the Meuse River or threaten Antwerp. The critical fuel depots at Stavelot remained in American hands, and German armor was literally running out of gas in the Belgian countryside. By December 27th, American forces were beginning limited counterattacks to reduce the bulge in their lines. The initiative, which had belonged to Germany for 11 days, was slowly shifting back to the Allies. The cost of Hitler's gamble was becoming apparent. Entire panzer divisions had been destroyed or rendered combatant effective in Germany's last strategic reserves were exhausted. As the year 1944 drew to a close, the Battle of the Bulge had reached its climax. The German offensive, born of desperation and sustained by surprise, was beginning its inevitable collapse. The question was no longer whether Hitler's gamble would succeed, but how quickly Allied forces could eliminate the remaining German salient and restore their defensive lines. December 28th marked the beginning of systematic. Designed to eliminate the German bulge and restore the pre-offensive lines, General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, coordinated a complex pincer movement involving Patton's 3rd Army attacking from the south and General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army pressing from the north. The methodical reduction of the salient would prove as costly and difficult as the initial German breakthrough. Major General Ernest Harman's 2nd Armored Division spearheaded the northern assault, striking German positions near Celles with overwhelming firepower. Harman, a veteran of North African campaigns, who had earned the nickname Old Gravel Voice, deployed his Shermans in classic combined arms attacks that leveraged American superiority in artillery and close air support. The German 2nd Panzer Division, which had advanced within 4 miles of the Meuse River, found itself surrounded and systematically destroyed. The destruction of the 2nd Panzer Division represented a microcosm of Germany's broader strategic failure. Colonel Meinrad von Laukert, the division commander, had led his men closer to the strategic objective of Antwerp, than any other German unit. However, fuel shortages and determined American resistance had stopped the advance just short of the Meuse crossing at Dinant. Now, with American armor attacking from multiple directions, von Lauchert's proud division was being methodically annihilated. Post-war interrogations of German commanders, conducted by Allied intelligence officers, revealed that fuel shortages became critical by December 21st, forcing many units to abandon operational vehicles. Staff Sergeant Donald Phelps of the 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion witnessed the final destruction of German armor near Sels. The veteran non-commissioned officer, who had fought from Sicily to the Rhine, described the scene as a graveyard of burning tanks and vehicles stretching for miles. German crews, many of them seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front, fought with desperate courage, even as their tactical situation became hopeless. To the east, the reduction of the St. Vith salient proceeded with methodical brutality. Brigadier General Robert Hasbrook's 7th Armored Division, which had held the town for 6 crucial days, was finally authorized to withdraw 2 more defensible positions. The fighting withdrawal, conducted under intense German pressure, showcased American tactical flexibility and unit cohesion under extreme stress. Colonel Dwight Rosebaum of the 8th Tank Battalion covered the withdrawal from St. Vith with a series of delaying actions that allowed the bulk of American forces to escape encirclement. Rosebaum, whose battalion had been reduced to fewer than 20 operational Shermans, conducted a fighting retreat through the villages of Vilsum and Samchow that became a textbook example of armored offensive tactics. The German forces, meanwhile, were beginning to show signs of systematic collapse. The 6th Panzer Army, which had spearheaded Hitler's offensive, was reduced to less than 30% of its original strength. SS General Sepp Dietrich, the army commander and old Nazi Party stalwart, privately acknowledged to his staff that the offensive had failed and that further attacks would only result in unnecessary casualties. Hitler's response to the deteriorating situation was characteristic of his leadership throughout the war's final phase. Rather than authorizing strategic withdrawal to preserve his remaining forces, the Führer demanded continued attacks regardless of tactical circumstances. Orders from the Wolf's Lair insisted that German forces must hold their positions at all costs and prepare for renewed offensive operations. General Hasso von Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had achieved the deepest penetration of American lines, began unauthorized withdrawals to save what remained of his command. Manteuffel, a professional soldier who understood military reality better than his political superiors, recognized that continued offensive operations would result in the complete destruction of Germany's armored reserve. The weather, Chad, initially favored German operations, now worked decisively against them. Clear skies allowed Allied fighter bombers to operate with impunity against German columns retreating along snow-covered roads. The same narrow forest tracks that had concealed the initial advance now became killing zones where American pilots could destroy vehicles with methodical precision. By January 1st, 1945, the tactical situation had reversed completely. German forces were in full retreat across most of the battlefield, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape Allied encirclement. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West, was entering its final phase as American and British forces prepared to eliminate the remaining German salient and restore their defensive lines. The human cost of the offensive was becoming apparent on both sides. American casualties exceeded 19,000 killed and wounded, while German losses approached 100,000, including prisoners. More significantly for Germany's war effort, the offensive had consumed the Reich's last strategic reserves and eliminated any possibility of conducting further major operations in the West. January 25, 1945, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge, as American forces restored their original defensive lines along the German border. The elimination of the German salient had taken exactly 40 days from the initial attack, transforming Hitler's desperate gamble into a strategic catastrophe that hastened the Third Reich's final collapse. General Dwight Eisenhower surveyed the devastated battlefield from his command vehicle, accompanied by General Omar Bradley and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The supreme Allied commander, whose reputation had been severely tested by the German surprise attack, could finally assess the full scope of both the crisis and its resolution. Twisted metal and abandoned equipment littered the snow-covered landscape. Silent testimony to the ferocity of 6 weeks of continuous combat. The human cost of Hitler's gamble was staggering on both sides. American casualties totaled 9,000 killed, wounded, and missing, making the Battle of the Bulge the costliest engagement fought by United States forces in the European theater. German losses exceeded 100,000, including irreplaceable veteran units from the Waffen-SS and regular Wehrmacht that could never be reconstituted. Official casualty figures compiled by the armies, historical divisions show that 19,000 Americans were killed during the 6-week battle, with many units suffering casualty rates exceeding 50%. Colonel Johann Piper, whose Kampfgruppe had spearheaded the initial breakthrough, was captured by American forces near La Gleize after abandoning his vehicles and attempting to infiltrate back to German lines on foot. The SS officer, once considered among Germany's most capable tactical commanders, would later face war crimes charges for the Malmedy massacre and other atrocities committed during the offensive. The strategic implications of the German defeat extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Hitler's decision to commit his last reserves to the Ardennes offensive fatally weakened German defenses along the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing their final assault on Berlin. The panzer divisions destroyed in Belgium could have provided crucial mobile reserves against the Red Army's winter offensive. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, whose defiant response to German surrender demands had made him a national hero, reflected on the lessons learned during the siege of Bastogne. The airborne general would later command the 103rd Infantry Division in the final advance into Germany, recognized that American success had depended on the tactical flexibility and initiative of junior officers and non-commissioned officers fighting isolated battles. The Battle of the Bulge also demonstrated the decisive importance of Allied interior superiority and logistical capabilities. While German forces achieved tactical surprise and initial success, they lacked the fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment necessary to sustain offensive operations. American forces, supported by an uninterrupted flow of supplies from the SEC, United States, could absorb initial losses and mount effective counterattacks. General George Patton's Third Army emerged from the battle with enhanced reputation. Having executed one of the most remarkable strategic maneuvers in military history, the 90-degree turn from eastward advance to northward relief of Bastogne showcased American organizational capabilities and the aggressive leadership that had characterized Patton's career since North Africa. For Adolf Hitler, the failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine marked the effective end of his strategic options in the West. The Fuhrer, increasingly isolated in his underground bunker and showing signs of mental deterioration, continued to issue impossible orders for counterattacks with non-existent forces. The gap between Hitler's fantasy world and military reality had become unbridgeable. The German people, who had initially celebrated news of the Ardennes offensive as evidence that the war might still be won, gradually realized that their country's situation was hopeless. The failure to achieve decisive victory in the West, combined with continued Soviet advances in the East, made German defeat inevitable. Popular morale, already strained by years of strategic bombing and military disasters, approached complete collapse as Allied forces prepared for their final offensive across the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge entered military history as a testament to both the unpredictability of warfare and the decisive importance of national will. Hitler's last gamble had failed not because of tactical errors, because the strategic foundation of the Third Reich had already crumbled beyond repair. The snowy forests of the Ardennes, which had witnessed some of the most desperate fighting of the entire war, gradually returned to silence. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and with it died any remaining hope that Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich might survive the approaching Allied victory. The final reckoning of World War II in Europe would come within 4 months, as British, American, and Soviet forces converged on Berlin for the Third Reich's inevitable surrender.